Thank you very much, Amaranta. Can you hear me?
We can hear you perfectly.
Yes, thank you so much. So good afternoon, good morning, and perhaps also good evening to everyone, and a warm welcome to all of you to the second webinar of a three-part series on the use of learning assessment data in the planning cycle. So today's session focuses on policies and institutional settings for the use of learning data. Policies are meant to create coherence in the implementation of learning assessment data systems and foster opportunities for their use. And institutional settings can support the fact that learning data directly feeds into planning and decision making. But is this a reality at the country level? This has been one of the research questions directly addressed in the IAP ULAT research. This webinar series marks the release of the IAP UNESCO publications on the use of learning assessment data in the education planning cycle. It aims to share findings from the studies, shedding light on the main obstacles encountered by educational planners in sub-Saharan Africa when using learning assessment data and lessons learned on how to improve their use. Let me say some words about the program of today's webinar and the panelists. So the topic, institutionalization of assessment, lessons for the use of learning assessment data. We are going to have a first presentation on this topic by Yeva Raudonite, the lead researcher of the unit of the ULET research project, and also Tuamanaya Foima Bafisi. Yeva is an associate research officer in the IAP research and development team. She coordinates the IAP's research program on the use of learning assessment data in the planning cycle and contributes to IAP learning portal activities. And Tuamanaya Foima Pafisi is an education consultant. She contributed to the implementation of the research program on the use of learning assessment data at IAP UNESCO. Then we are going to have a presentation from the Gambia, the assessment policy in the Gambia, by Mudu Toure. Mudu Toure is an educationist who has worked as a qualified classroom teacher for several years before joining the assessment unit of the Gambia Ministry of Basic and Secondary Education. His core function at this assessment unit is to help head teachers and teachers make good use of assessment data to improve teaching and learning. Mudu has participated in various education research studies for his ministry. Then we are going to have another presentation on the right data for the right purpose by Sarah Richardson from the Australian Council for Education Research. Sarah is currently the Deputy CEO and Research Director of ASER UK, coordinating a team of researchers in the London office of ASER. And then we will hear from Davide Ruscelli, Project Manager in Education at the Dhaka office. He is currently ensuring the interim of the teaching and learning cluster of the UNESCO multisectoral Dhaka office, and he coordinates the Talent Secretariat, a task team of the regional coordination group of SDG4. And then we will have some 20 minutes for questions and answers coordinated by Lynn Sergeant, the manager of the IAP learning portal. And now I turn it on to Yeva for the first presentation.
Thank you very much, Michaela. And hello, everyone. I'm very happy to welcome you in today's session, in the second session in our series on the use of learning assessment data. And before jumping to the theme of today's session, I would like to go back to the main elements that we addressed in last week's webinar. So if you were with us last Tuesday, you may remember that we looked at how learning assessment data are used in different phases of the planning cycle. We also introduced the project in more general terms. We then turned to different factors that might influence the observed use of learning assessment data. We examined the quality of assessment reports and dissemination of assessment results. And I would now like to go back to the issue of capacities that we did not have the time to address last week. So this is one of the most important findings of our study, and I'm happy that we have the time today to explore with you this issue in more depth. In our study, we saw that when learning assessments are introduced in context with low national technical capacities, and in addition, in a lack of a regulatory framework that we will address today, systems really struggle to produce and use learning assessment data. This is why capacity development is indeed a key element to improve assessment systems and the use of their data, especially considering that these are very resource-intensive tasks. It is also important to differentiate between capacities to produce and use learning assessment results, because very often they require different skills. And unfortunately, the use of learning data has received less attention in the available capacity development plans. This issue is further exacerbated by a lack of guidance for actors on how more practically use assessment results in their everyday tasks. In our research, we saw that interviewees emphasized the importance of these results, but sometimes they needed more guidance on how very practically they can use them in their everyday activities. Although there have been many capacity development activities that were undertaken in countries that we worked in, overall capacities to produce and use learning data remain low, although this varies by country and by administrative level, for instance. We saw that at decentralized level, officials have greater needs for capacity development. However, we also saw countries that developed and created very strong assessment teams at the central level. This was the case in INEADE, in Senegal, and the Examination Council of Zambia, although even these institutions currently struggle to renew their staff. In other countries, the needs for capacity development still remain quite high, and there have been specific training needs that were raised in our study. We saw that more training is needed in advanced statistical analysis, especially in terms of econometric techniques to estimate the influence of different factors on learning. And we can link this back to the issues that we addressed in the first webinar, the issues that existed in the analysis of assessment results and assessment reports, and also in education sector analysis. More training is also needed for data interpretation and translation of findings for policy recommendation, as well as the use of software for data analysis and database management. We also saw that this issue of lack of statistical skills expands to the entire education sector, and this creates situations when often a very small group of qualified individuals is in charge of very large assessments, and these teams remain overburdened. And one of our interviewees very rightfully referred to this 20-80 rule, where the 20% of staff does 80% of the work. And this indeed was the case in some of the countries that we worked in. And this links back to the issue of capacities also that are unevenly distributed across and inside units. We also saw that assessment teams often suffer from and are particularly sensitive to high turnover rates. And this definitely decreases the effectiveness of training programs, of different training efforts. And although our study did not allow to explore the in-depth causes of this, we saw that this is definitely an important issue to be addressed in the future. We also saw that a lack of national capacities in some cases lead to outsourcing of certain assessment tasks. And this might negatively affect the national ownership of learning assessment data, as this interrupts the national data management cycle. But finally, I would like to end this slide on a more positive note, because we also saw that participation in cross-national assessments can help further develop capacities. And also we saw that in countries where this attention was specifically on capacity development, positive effects were achieved. We saw that in the Gambia, there has been a high-level commitment right from the beginning to create an assessment unit and develop their capacities, also transferring skills from external partners to national officers. And the assessment unit has become a technically sound focal point for assessments and now brings together different actors in the system, which also positively affect the use of learning data. So now let's turn to the topic of today's session, and we'll look at the institutionalization of assessments. And in today's presentation, Tomanaya and myself will first explore the issue of a lack of coherence among different learning assessments. And we will then link it to the regulatory framework. We'll look at assessment policies as well as institutional settings for assessment teams. So in a number of countries that we studied, we observed a patchwork of different learning assessments. And sometimes there has been a lack of coherence and complementarity among numerous assessments that were available in countries, and this in different respects. The main issue stems from the fact that numerous assessments often do not articulate well. We saw this, and sometimes assessments cover overlapping grades, or they have overlapping goals. In some cases, some grades remain uncovered, and they are sometimes misaligned with the SDG 4 indicators. Also, sometimes they do not provide information that can be easily interpreted together for new insights. And we saw that, for instance, in Namibia, SACMEC and a national assessment assessed 3 consecutive grades, grades 5, 6, and 7, but then learning at earlier and later stages of the education system remains undocumented. You can see here the example of Senegal that has even 7 different learning assessments, although not of exactly the same character, but some of them also evaluate the same grades or are conducted at short intervals. And this leads to a number of issues with coherence among these assessments, and leads to some negative consequences, as first of all, financial and human resources that are already limited sometimes are further scattered, sometimes to evaluate exactly the same grades and for very similar purposes. We also saw that this poor articulation between assessments leads to situations when assessment results are analyzed in isolation without making a link between different data sets. And finally, that the differentiation among different assessments is less clear for actors in the system. We saw, especially at decentralized levels throughout different interviews, that there has been often some confusion about the definition of examinations and large-scale assessments and how different large-scale assessments actually are different. Another issue related to this is that national learning assessments, as well as other large-scale assessments, are also meant to inform global metrics, and more specifically the SDG indicator 4.1.1. And here in the table, you can see while some education levels are well covered by these assessments, and for instance, in Senegal, you can see that there are 3 different assessments that can report on one education level. Other levels sometimes remain undocumented, as for instance, it's mostly the case at the end of lower secondary education. So one of the factors that both contributes to and arises from this problem of coherence is the lack of a regulatory framework for learning assessment systems. And the literature has put a body of evidence showing that institutionalization of assessments is important so that they are not seen as one-off isolated exercises, and so that they are integrated into regular ministry operations in order to improve the use of the data. So we looked at this institutionalization from 2 different angles, through the assessment policies and the institutional settings of assessment teams. So let's now explore assessment policies. The literature shows that these documents have big potential to provide a strategic vision for the assessment system, and it can include different elements. It can, first of all, define the intended use of learning assessment data, also define measurement priorities and specific characteristics of the learning assessment. It can also identify the primary users of the assessment data and describe the kind of assessment information that it will provide. They can also include dissemination strategies that we've mentioned last week, and just help the wider community to better understand the assessment system and its main purposes. And So we saw this issue of a bit of a vicious circle, because these policies have a potential to improve assessment systems and provide this vision for these systems, and their lack indeed might contribute to more poorly articulated assessments. But we also saw that as large-scale assessments have been introduced in countries gradually, not always strategically, as very often as external projects, this delayed the development of assessment policies and made it sometimes difficult to establish them. And in the countries that we studied, we saw that this multiplication of student assessments that was strongly encouraged by external partners was not timely accompanied by a development of an assessment policy, which sometimes meant that assessments were not completely aligned with each other and were not necessarily always introduced in a strategic way. You can see that the Gambia and Zambia have assessment policies in place, and we'll review them today, while 4 other countries do not currently have these policies, but their development is foreseen. And I think it's important to mention that this does not mean that there are no official documents providing guidance on assessment implementation in those countries. Elements can be found dispersed in a number of different documents, such as conceptual frameworks or circulars, but there is no one document that provides a more strategic vision. And this is why it was sometimes difficult for our interviewees to speak about this often fragmented regulatory framework, and sometimes difficult also to differentiate among assessments. I would now like to introduce the example of Zambia, and unfortunately our researchers could not be today with us to present it, and I will just briefly introduce this example because it's a very interesting one. The National Learning Assessment Framework of Zambia is an overarching document that defines the principles that apply to all assessments in Zambia. It defines key concepts related to assessments, as well as the intended use of assessment data in general, and then for more specific actor groups. It also shows how different assessments can articulate with one another and defines responsibilities of actors. It even shows some conditions for an effective use of assessment data, such as their timely release. So this is a very interesting example. And this framework also provides and defines this free two-way flow of information, trying to ensure that information really reaches all actors in the system. However, some issues have been raised with the implementation of this framework, and notably it was mentioned that there was a bit of a lack of ownership of the document. And this leads us to speak about different preconditions that are important for an effective implementation of assessment policies. And we'll now turn to Tumanaya for this, and we'll also switch to French. So our Anglophone audience, please make sure you are on the English channel. And I now give the floor to Tumanaya.
Sorry, Tumanaya, we cannot hear you.
Is that okay now?
Now it's perfect. Thank you, Tumanaya.
Okay. Pardon. Donc,
right. I was just saying that what is our study telling us about the preconditions for an evaluation policy? Now, first of all, this policy must be developed with an inclusive process where many stakeholders must participate. So you need political decision makers who are specialists in decision making. And we really have to make sure that these stakeholders can comment on what's going to be evaluated. And this would really help the results to be to go down well. And this is what did not happen in Zambia, because the NLIF was done in a very closed circle of actors, which really created problems in its ownership and implementation. So secondly, this assessment policy must be disseminated within the sector. And this is exactly what the Gambian example tells us. The evaluation policy really did provide strategic guidelines to stakeholders involved in evaluation. But for the decentralized stakeholders, it really was not that relevant, because they were they really were not involved in the design and implementation of the evaluation policy. The last point that was underlined by the study is that this evaluation policy must be well aligned and well consistent with other key policies in the sector, such as the teacher training, school curriculum. And what happened in Zambia was that the evaluation policy was aligned on the education framework and also the implementation by the teachers. In Gambia, the evaluation policy was basically a part of the sector plan. So in both cases, we could ensure that strategic activities linked to the evaluation have been taken into account in the various other activities through the various sector plans. Could we move on to the next slide, please? Thank you. So we're now going to look at MS and how MS contains assessment data. Now, in most countries, MS does not contain assessment data. Now, this is extremely important because, as we saw during the first webinar, the question of dissemination is often problematic because it's done in paper format, so the various stakeholders don't receive it. So assessment data must be integrated into a centralized system like MS, and that will really ensure its accessibility, and the assessment data will be in an ecosystem that will basically feed into political decision making. Now, in most countries, SIEGE does not contain assessment. The MS does not contain data. There is a MS system in Namibia and Guinea, but it does not contain assessment data. In Senegal, there are multiple administrative and pedagogical applications that are in place, and this is used by the administration in the school, but again, they do not contain assessment data. And lastly, in Ghana and Zambia, the assessment data is stored, but it is fragmented amongst various stakeholders in the education, and sometimes even with third parties. So all this really cannot form a consistent and a coherent base. Gambia is the only country where MS has been collecting assessment data since 2011, and the problems with strategic storage of data have already been identified in this country, and they've been resolved. Next slide, please. So we've seen in the first part that institutional settings starts by developing policy in the field. Now we're going to look at the second aspect, which is institutional settings for assessment teams. And now, there are several configurations possible in terms of institutional settings for assessment teams. First of all, it's depending on the closeness to the Ministry of Education. So you have both all these configurations have their benefits and their risks. So first of all, the assessment department is a unit within the Ministry or the Department of Education. So this closeness will really facilitate coordination between assessments, curriculum, and pedagogy. But the risk is that it will also be exposed to political interference. for instance, that could prevent the publication of results and even throw a spanner in the way assessment is conducted. Then the institution in charge of assessment could be a semi-autonomous institution with their own budget, like research centers or national statistical institutes. So in this case, we've got more independence from political and collegial entities, but there could be a poor alignment with other education policies. Now, this is an advantage we had with the previous case. Then the examination board can also carry out evaluations over and above its usual task of certifying or selecting students. So in this case, the first benefit is you're leveraging on an existing institutional capacity, but the risk is the institution could be completely overwhelmed because it already has a clear mandate. Now, it's also possible to outsource a part of the evaluations or all the evaluations to a university, to an NGO, or an equivalent organization. This really means that you could palliate the lack of technical service in assessment teams, but the fact that it's so far from the university means that it really could not, there would be no national ownership, and this could really interrupt the national cycle of data management. So, given the comparison, I'd really like to know your opinion. In your opinion, which entity is best positioned to manage learning assessments? You've got a few seconds to answer this question. Could we please see the answers, Camilla?
Donne encore 10 secondes parce qu'il y a encore beaucoup de gens.
10 seconds more, please. There are still people who are answering.
D'accord.
Right. So the results are quite interesting because for you, it's a standard solution, a unit within the ministry that's best positioned to manage learning data, followed by semi-autonomous, semi-public autonomous institutions. Thank you so much for your answers. So we've seen that there are different configurations depending on the closeness to the ministry. Now we're going to focus on another dimension, which is the level of concentration of assessment-related activities and cooperation. So various scenarios depending on the type of collaboration between the various stakeholders. So in the first case, all tasks linked to assessments are done by a single institution. So again, the question of cooperation does not even arise, except in cases like Senegal, where in the same institution you've got different departments that are in charge of school books, school textbooks, or curriculum. So cooperation is important in this case. The second case is tasks linked to assessments are dispersed, and this could be the case where the departments are being managed, are managing ERGA and EGMA. So this could be a strategic choice in order to have a better result between this, but there is a risk here. The collaboration could be quite poor. The communication could be quite poor between the various departments. So again, there could be less expertise, and this is what we observed in Namibia. The third scenario is that the tasks linked to assessments are dispersed, but the communication is very good and efficient in order to have a flow of information amongst the various departments. So this is what we observed in Gambia. Next slide, please. So when we look at these two dimensions, closeness to the ministry and the level of concentration of activities, and we represent these countries in a graph, this is how the graph looks like. So top left, we've got this traditional scenario where a single department is managing all the responsibilities linked to assessments, which is the case in Guinea and Ghana. Then you've got Senegal, where you've got the same concentration, but same scenario, but the responsibilities related to LSAs are concentrated in a single semi-autonomous public institution. Then we've got Gambia, where the responsibilities are dispersed across various departments, and the main department is an examination committee which is located within the ministry. And then in Gambia, you've got the same responsibilities, and the main unit is located within the ministry. So what lessons can we learn? First of all, when assessments are close, departments, assessments institutionally close, and that could really bring, assessments could actually bring units closer, especially with curriculum and planning. But there is a risk of dispersion of technical expertise, which is not uniform through the various departments, and especially when there is no communication amongst the various stakeholders, then the fact that you are in the same organization does not guarantee collaboration. And this is exactly the case in Guinea, where the assessment department and this is the case in Senegal as well. The last important lesson is that irrespective of the configuration chosen, there should be trust amongst the assessment teams, and impartiality is the key, and you need to take assessment very seriously. So I'm now going to thank you for your attention, and I'm leaving you my contact details if ever you wish to contact me. Thank you so much. I'm giving the floor back to Michaela. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lieva and Tomayaya, for this presentation of the research results. We've seen the different aspects related to institutionalization, the policies, and the institutional framework. So we do understand how important these two aspects are when it comes to using the students' learning data. And you also talked about a certain number of success factors, which one may hope to have in a certain context. And you explained how you came up with them through research in a very interesting presentation. And we will see how things happen in the Gambia. So,
from the Gambian Ministry of Basic and Secondary Education for the presentation of assessment policy in the Gambia. Modu, are you with us?
Yes, I'm coming on.
Yeah, we can hear you now. Great.
Is my presentation shown in the slides or? Hello?
We cannot yet see your slides.
Let's see my slides. No. Yeah.
Yes.
Not so yet. Hello, are you seeing the presentations now on the slides?
Yes, we can see it now. Huh? But can you put it in the slide mode? Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Clear now.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Modu Ture from the assessment unit, presented on behalf of the whole assessment team in the Gambia. Now, our presentation is on the title Assessment Policy in the Gambia. Now, in the presentation, we will be looking at the background of the assessment policy, the aims and objectives of the policy, in the policy development process, as well as assessment policy alignment with other national policies. Now, the assessment policy was drafted in 2015 and will run through 2022. Different education stakeholders participated in the process, the development process of the assessment policy. In developing the assessment policy, there were rationale, and one of the rationale for the development of the assessment policy was the absence of guidelines to support teachers' education, to support teachers, education officers, and policymakers to conduct formative assessment in schools in order to support teaching and learning. Another rationale was the absence of simple assessment framework that non-assessment specialists can understand and use in the Gambia. The lack of a coherent culture of the monitoring of assessment activities in the Gambia, so as to make aware the importance and necessity of such classroom-based assessment. Lack of uniform, standardized reporting and recording formats of assessment in the grades at school and cluster level were some of the rationale for the development of the assessment policy in the Gambia. Now, the main aim and objective of the policy is to develop and maintain an efficient and effective assessment system that will contribute to the improvement of quality education at all levels. The specific objective of the policy includes establishing a standardized and uniform assessment system, improving accountability in the assessment by allowing all stakeholders to assess and use assessment data and information. Empowering and providing teachers and students with opportunity to appreciate, attain, and recognize weaknesses on how to improve on them. There were intensive and extensive policy dialogue in form of consultations through meetings and working sessions among the stakeholders. This talk about the process of the development process of the assessment policy. These sessions generated feedbacks that provided the basis for the outline of the policy, as well as the need to develop subsidiary documents on assessment protocols and monitoring guidelines. Series of drafts of these documents were produced and reviewed by stakeholders in an organized process, culminating the final version of the policy. Now, there were different stakeholders that participated in the development of the assessment policy, and these stakeholders include school teachers, the Ministry of Education staff that works on standard settings, monitoring and evaluation, curriculum development, and classroom management. Parent representatives were also invited to participate in the development of the assessment policy. Likewise, development partners such as UNICEF and National Commission for UNESCO and other NGOs all participated. Teacher training institutions such as the Gambia College and the University of the Gambia also participated in the development of the assessment policy. Specialized assessment institutions such as the West African Examination Council, the national office in the Gambia here, they also participated in the development process. They were actively involved. Civil society organizations such as the Gambia Teachers Union and Evernet, Education for All campaign network, all participated in the process of developing the assessment policy in the Gambia. Now, the contents in the policy. Now, the first thing we look at in the policy was guiding principles, proposed aims and objectives. The policy also look at the policy priorities, policy implementation arrangement, and this is the list of some of the arrangements that will guide the implementation of the policy. And one of them is establishment of an assessment unit for the coordination of national assessment and examinations. Orientate and train practitioners on the understanding and use of assessment protocols. Establish assessment committees and develop their terms of reference. develop and implement assessment and examination data management system, develop and utilize assessment and examination banks of items, develop and implement standardization protocols for reliability and validity, develop and implement a reward system linking to the STAR system, develop and enforce code of ethics in the conduct of assessment, develop and implement a remedial system to support low-performing students, mobilize funding to support the implementation of the policy. The content also contains like institutional arrangement of the assessment policy, the implementation strategies. The assessment policy is still implemented at the HCD settings, lower basic, upper basic, and senior school settings, assessment for candidates with special needs, assessment for non-formal education, the financing is also one the content, another content in the policy, likewise the monitoring of the policy implementation process. Now the impact and relevance of the policy. The policy informed the establishment of the assessment unit, which now collaborates with West Africa Examination Council to coordinate all activities, all assessment activities for Ministry of Basic and Secondary Education. The Gambia assessment policy provides a solid institutional basis for the effective use of learning data. The policy has encouraged to use data from planning, example, data for planning, example, the school improvement plan. It enhanced the use of assessment data for curriculum reform, material development, and policy decision. It informs the education sector on teacher in-service training and allocation. Now, the document when developing the assessment policy document, it goes with some supporting documents as well. And one of those supporting documents was the monitoring framework and also the assessment protocol, or we call it the guideline document. They were the two main guideline documents for the assessment policy. These documents help to support and direct the implementation of the assessment policy. Now, the assessment protocols take place processes and procedures of assessment at school, cluster, regional, and national levels. It is designed to regulate and guide educators, most especially teachers, in the planning, preparation, administration and reporting, and use of learning assessment data. The assessment framework provides, sometimes we call it assessment guideline. Now it provides a common basis for monitoring assessment practices at all levels to ensure a better commitment to implementing the ideas and processes highlighted in the assessment protocol. A set of performance and compliance indicators are provided to help verify the level of successes of overall assessment practices and policy implementation. The assessment policy aligned with other national policies. The guiding principles are in conformity with the national education policy of providing responsive, relevant, and quality education for all. The assessment policy is guided by the pronouncement in education policy system, that's the national education policy, which states that assessment will include formal examination, continuous assessment, routine and ad hoc diagnostic tests. And other forms of assessment will be used on the curriculum. Benchmarks will be established also to determine and monitor the standards of education across the basic and senior secondary levels in pursuit of excellence. I think that's the end of the presentation. Over the mic to the coordinator.
Yeah, thank you so much, Modu, I think for this comprehensive and very practical presentation of the assessment policy in the Gambia. So you explained that the whole project of setting up the policy came really from an analysis that there was fragmentation in the system and that needed to be addressed. And I think there are quite a number of very interesting practices that you have mentioned. I think first, of course, relates also to the prior presentation and the importance of broad stakeholder involvement in policy development. I think that comes out very clearly. And another element that I found very interesting, which is the development of supporting technical documents, because I think it's the policy is one thing, but technical guidance is another one, and perhaps that relates also to to the capacity development aspect that was highlighted in the very beginning by Yeva. So thank you very much, Modo. And then I pass it on to Sarah from ASER to make a presentation on the right data for the right purpose.
Thank you very much, Michaela. Just try sharing my screen. Hopefully this will work okay. So hopefully you can see my presentation.
Yes.
And there it is in presentation mode.
Yeah.
So you can see that. Great. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to everyone today on behalf of my colleagues at ACER. As an organization with a lot of expertise in assessment, we're in the position of providing technical support and advice to a lot of countries around the world. And I've particularly worked in the South Asian region, so I'll use some examples from that region. I've got a fairly short amount of time today, so I wanted to just focus on three key areas, things that we come across often and that are very strongly related to the institutional context for assessment. So first of all, some common myths around the use of assessment data. Secondly, selecting the right data for the right purpose. And then thirdly, planning solutions identified by assessment data. So on the right side of the screen, you can see the 14 key areas of a robust assessment program. This is something that ACER has developed, and you may have seen it before. And you can see at the top, sort of at 1 o'clock, just or 12:30 position, you can see policy goals and issues. That's the starting point, and then it comes all the way around in a clockwise direction into reporting and dissemination. And so I want to focus on that element of reporting and dissemination. Now, we know that the data from assessment can be used for lots of different reasons. And we can think about assessment as national or international assessment, such as PISA, but also that assessment that's done at a regional level or at a state level, but also not forgetting, like Mudu, I'm also a former teacher. So a lot of the assessment that is done is at the school level. Now, in order to have assessment data inform practice or policy, and at the end of the day, that's the whole goal of assessment, is collecting data to inform improvements. These are 5 myths that I've often come across in dealing with stakeholders at the national or state level. And a big one, I think, is retrofitting. So often an assessment cycle can be quite long. And so often when people decide on the goals for assessment at the beginning, by the time they get to the end, they've changed their mind. And they actually want the assessment data to inform something else. And this can be a real problem. So to give you an example, I worked with a state in India, and they were assessing students' reading and maths. And then they said that they were using the data to decide how much to pay teachers, so to give performance-based pay to teachers. And the problem there is that was not the point of the assessment cycle. If you want to evaluate teacher skills, teacher knowledge, then you would develop an assessment to do that for that purpose. But it's not really possible to retrofit. So this is really coming back to that importance at the institutional level of having a really clear idea from the beginning of what you want to achieve. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The second one, and it's related to this first point, is assessment data can be used for different things, but it can't be used for everything. So, for example, if you're doing a national level of assessment, you can't then use that for teachers to identify how students in their own classes are performing. That's a different function. So it's very important, I think, to understand at that institutional level to decide from the beginning, what do we want to achieve? And then to decide what kind of data, what kind of assessment data we need. So I'll give you an example. We're working with the government in Scotland at the moment. And in Scotland, they decided that the most important purpose of their national assessment was to give teachers data to inform their decision making. And as a result, the national assessment data only goes to teachers. It does not go to the government. The reason they did this is because they knew that if the government had the data, it would be very easy for the government to use the data to judge schools, and teachers would be against that. And so they made the decision that if they wanted to achieve their goal, they had to give the data directly to teachers, and then teachers could decide what to do with it. So that's a really great example of having a very clear idea of what you want to achieve, and then making sure all of the components of the system work together to achieve that. A third one, and we come across this a lot when we work with people leading assessment activities, is that the reporting is the final point. That you go through all of the logistics and the complexities of an assessment cycle, and then you produce a report. And sometimes we see, like a 300-page report with lots of tables and charts and diagrams. But for us, that's really the beginning. It's not the end. So that the assessment process is to identify and collect that data, but the reporting is not the end point. The end point is, what do you do with it? What's the purpose? So the purpose is not to just collect lots of information. And I think, that there's always a tension with assessment data about how quickly you can see change in the education sector. And I know all of us who've worked in education sectors in different countries know that change is really slow. So it's not possible to just change one thing and expect everything to magically change. And so I think an important use of assessment data and an important understanding at the institutional level is how incremental change is. And again, I'll look at that in a little bit more detail. And the final one, and I think this has been mentioned already, is just because you have a report with lots of data, lots of tables and diagrams, that doesn't mean that people understand it to interpret it. I think those of us who work with data a lot, it's a very common error that we think, well, if I look at a chart, I can read it, I can understand it, it's obvious, it's easy. It's not easy for a lot of people. And so what we find often, for example, at a school level, is there may be a data team, a group of teachers in each school whose job it is to try and interpret any data and explain it to their colleagues. And I think that goes back up to the ministry level as well. Often there's a real barrier at the ministry level. And I'm not talking about someone is not a psychometrician. I'm talking about the fact that it is a very difficult process to identify numbers, to look at numbers and turn them into actions. And so that requires a lot of support and training. So I've just taken the top section of our 14-step diagram here. And as I said, the critical point at the institutional level is deciding what information you need and for what purpose at the beginning. And that includes, and this is one that often is a problem, what is the level of the reporting? So if you decide that you're going to report at the national level, you can't then later on say, oh, I'm going to use this data to look at the performance of different schools, because it's not being designed for that purpose. And I think this is often forgotten. So it's really important to make sure that at an institutional level, and all of the stakeholders involved have a very clear sense, this is what we're going to collect information, and this is how we're going to use it. And that means that when you get to sampling, when you get to test design, when you get to all of the other elements, that purpose remains very prominent in thinking, that it doesn't get changed halfway through. And part of this, I think, is being really clear with stakeholders on what the data can and cannot show. So a lot of people think that if you're looking at national data, you can filter that down and you can look at lots and lots of different things. I mentioned the use of data about to give performance pay to teachers. And what that doesn't understand is that there are many, many aspects that influence student learning, and teachers are just one of them. So again, if you want to look at something specific, like how teachers are performing professionally, you would design an assessment for that purpose specifically. And finally, and I think this is often a misunderstanding as well, is that assessment data indicates solutions. It doesn't. It gives indications of areas in need of attention. And so when we work with governments, when we work with organizations doing assessment, we always emphasize what has to happen next. So one of the key considerations, I think, is that assessment data can indicate that there is a problem, but not why that problem exists. So, for example, in many countries, girls outperform boys in reading, but we don't necessarily know exactly why that's happening. And if you want to solve a problem, you first have to understand it. And so what we often recommend doing is some qualitative research, doing some interviews with schools, interviews with teachers, really trying to find out what are the dynamics that lead to these outcomes. Because if you use an assumption, probably the intervention you put in place is not going to work. And that includes doing secondary analysis of the data, not just taking the basic results, but really digging into those in as much depth as you can. Another critical element at the institutional level is thinking about stakeholder mapping and stakeholder engagement. So if you want to have improvement in learning, you're going to need to think about policy, you're going to need to think about teacher training, curricula, learning resources, pedagogy, a whole range of different things. And one person cannot be responsible for all of those. So it's very common for the institution to think, well, we'll tell teachers that they have to do this one thing differently. And of course, to create change, we need lots of different things to happen all together. So I think mapping the stakeholders involved in improvement and then deciding how you're going to engage each one is really, really critical. Another key element is thinking about what strategies you're going to use. So thinking of a strategy, you don't want to roll that out at the national level. You want to pilot it first in the small scale, just to check that it has the impact that you need. And I think this is sometimes where policymakers can get frustrated because they want something done quickly. They want things to change quickly. And you can do things quickly, but I don't think that will necessarily lead to lasting change. To have lasting change, you really need to take the time to implement something that's going to work well. I think this next one is a really, really important one, bottom up versus top down. Teachers are obviously key stakeholders in an education system. And it's really important to give teachers agency. Teachers are professionals, they know their students, they need to have the training and support that they need, but they also need to be given the agency to make decisions as they need them. So I think really thinking about engaging teachers in decision-making, engaging them in planning, not just telling them what to do. Teachers hate being told what to do. So it's very important to engage them. And in any kind of intervention, not forgetting that evaluation and review phase. We can't assume that something's going to work because we think it's going to work. So all of these elements together really tell us that when we're planning assessment, we need to have a really clear idea of the data that we want to gather. And when we've gathered that data, we then need to really work through in a very systematic way, what are we going to do with it? What are we going to do next? How are we going to influence long-term sustainable positive change? And that means thinking about all of the different people that are going to be involved in that. So it's really important to have the assessment when we talk about who does it, it needs to be integrated in that overall educational planning. And finally, just a couple of resources here. So the one on the right is an ACR resource, Principles of Good Practice and Learning Assessment, and this is where you can find it. And this goes through those 14 steps and identifies things that you need to think about at each stage. And on the left, this is not yet been formally released, but we've been working with UNICEF, the Regional Office for South Asia, to support improved assessment at all different levels in all of the countries in South Asia. And so this is a website, allchildrenlearning.org, that is it was due to be formally launched last year, but of course, because of COVID, it's been delayed. But this will have links to some really useful resources, including on dissemination and reporting, as well as opportunities for training. So keep an eye out for that one. That will come out hopefully quite soon. So thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you all today. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for a very, very clear presentation. I think one of the main points that you made, and I think that is so important, is really to be clear about the purpose, the aim of the assessment exercise. I think that is really the starting point, because there are many purposes, there are many levels that can be tackled. So I think really this clarity of the purpose, I think, is really a main point. And I think you have provided lots of very interesting and very practical advice, I think, on the conduct of learning assessment data and also resources. So thank you very much for all that. So I pass it on then to Davide to be the discussant of the different presentations. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Michaela. Thank you very much. Well, let me start by thanking all the colleagues here today. And I think these were very interesting presentations, and there were a lot of elements that were common throughout the three different presentations. And I kind of want to react to these based on our experience. And our experience as Talent, the Teaching and Learning Educators Network for Transformation, which is a network that worked on issues related to learning assessment in the region, and we focused on really some of these elements that came out in this presentation. But before going into that, I just want to share one key consideration that I think the participants may have not noticed it today, but it was quite clear in the previous webinar of this learning series, and it also came out in our work. Tremendous progress has been made in terms of assessing learning in sub-Saharan Africa over the last 3 decades, particularly at national level. So we need to recognize that. I think it's a very important starting point. Just for you to mention, just to give some numbers, based on our work, it is estimated that since 1990, the percentage of countries in the region conducting one or more national learning assessment increased from 35 to 61%. So this is already a very good progress that we have noticed. And we have all this sort of mapping, like where we are now in terms of learning assessment in the region, that not only touches upon issues of policy or institutional environment, but also financing, use of learning data, and also different type of assessment. All of this is in a mapping that we've made, and it's here. I hope you can see it. It's called the Learning Assessment in Sub-Saharan Africa, and it was made through a survey that we conducted in 2018 and then again in 2019. And we got this feedback back from national focal points of our network. And some of the results differ from the IAEP's research, but most of them are actually they are on the same line. I'll get in any case back to this point later, or where we actually stand, and let me go more in the details of what we are and what Talent was, what Talent did, and particularly in terms of the use of learning assessment data. So as I said, Talent stands for Teaching and Learning Educators Network. We worked in the region, in the whole of Sub-Saharan Africa over the past 2 years, thanks to funding from the GPE. And some of the participants today may already know that, because it was mentioned in last week's webinar by Ramya Vivekanandan in the GPE's presentation. It was thanks to their A4L program. And we particularly focused on capacity building, knowledge sharing, and knowledge dissemination around learning assessment. Particularly, just to mention some of the work we did, and that is particularly relevant for today's webinar, I can talk about a couple of workshops we have organized. One in December 2019 in Yaoundé on the development of large-scale assessment. And another one took place in Dakar in November 2018 on the reporting, dissemination, and use of large-scale assessment results. Both workshops dealt with some key concepts that were briefly presented today, such as the good practices on learning assessment developed by ACR, and that we saw in Sarah's research presentation, and the level of utilization of learning of assessment data. So that was one of the key elements we dealt with. Particularly the first webinar, the one in 2019, gave us a lot of data for us to then develop a policy brief that we published end of last year in December 2020, that is titled Effective Use of Large-Scale Learning Assessment to Improve Learning Outcomes and Education System Reforms. This brief puts together some of the elements from the working session we did with the countries, and the results, what we found out clearly goes in the direction of what we saw today in IIEP's presentation, in the ACR's presentation, and in Gambia's presentation. Some of the key elements that I can quote that we also witnessed in our work are the lack of ownership in most of the cases of this learning assessment. A sort of limited capacity that is also due to a sort of misunderstanding of learning assessment. And key to all, which is also the reason why IIP started this research, the underutilization of data, and particularly the misunderstanding of the strategic role that learning assessment can have in improving education policies. So just to react today, I'm basing myself on our work, on our policy brief, and to react to the presentation, I want to discuss three key issues: capacity, ownership, and institutional collaborations that are, I think they came out in all the presentations, and they're key for today's topic. Building capacity and continuously build capacity of ministry staff is key. We did not work, unlike IEP did, at decentralized level. We mainly work at central level, and we mainly work with directors. But we also noticed that capacity is one of the concerns on the side of the countries, particularly. In our work, some of the elements mentioned by our colleague Eva came clearly out. One of the suggestions of improving capacity of assessment units that we reached is to better define roles and responsibility of the personnel of the assessment unit, and to establish a sort of a training regime. This may have a lot of implications in terms of funding and also in terms of organizing this training, but it's at least a sort of idea that it could be further discussed. For instance, we noticed that there is need of training for staff of the assessment units or assessment departments or bodies, which is essential for upgrading their expertise to manage, implement, and analyze assessment. And this should also target the communication of assessment results. Then there is need of training for other ministerial departments, and we get back to there in terms of institutional collaboration. But the value and use of large-scale assessment and assessment in general should be included in training for other departments, the curriculum department, inspectorate, national examinations, teacher training, etc. And finally, there is something that came out I believe, in all of the presentation is the need of training on how to analyze data. This was a request from most of the countries that participated in our workshops and that we engaged. But clearly, there is this sort of feeling that countries do not have the necessary capacity to well interpret data. So this clearly is seen as an important point. But on a more positive note, I think it's worth noticing that there is a lot of knowledge already, particularly at the central level, on what are the standards that will need to be followed. There is a lot of knowledge on how a good assessment should look like. But sometimes, and here we look at a different kind of capacity, there may be need for a sort of a trigger to apply this expertise. And in one of our working sessions, we used the ACR's good practices on learning assessment, all these different steps. We sat together with the countries, and the countries, they sat among themselves, and they clearly identified the areas where there was more need and how to improve their learning assessment cycle. So I think there, in terms of capacity, there is indeed a lot of need, but there is also something that already exists, and it's maybe an issue of giving the right tools to the country, or for the countries to equip themselves with the right tools. Then I want to discuss about ownership. I think this came out clearly in the presentation by IEP, particularly on the example of Zambia. Zambia has an learning assessment policy in place. Was the only country that has an actual policy that's also disseminated. But it looks like implementation is kind of blocked by this sort of, among other issues, also by this lack of ownership. This is key. We have noticed that also in the work we did with other countries. And it's a key element that needs to be improved. Our colleagues have some findings on how to improve that in the IP's presentation. And these are the same that are actually in the talent policy brief. Countries have invested a huge amounts of funding on developing and putting in place these assessments. Sometimes it's external funding, it's true. Sometimes it's their own resources. But this lack of ownership indeed has a negative effect on the use of this data. So it's something that needs to be worked on. There are steps in terms of participation that have already been adopted in some countries. The example of the Gambia is key. And indeed, there is need to involve all sectors of education: ministers, teacher training department, teachers themselves, inspectorate, principals, school and parent teachers associations, so that there is sort of a positive environment, a conducive environment for learning assessment. And also in the ACR presentation, we have heard how important stakeholder engagement is. And this brings me to the last point, the poor institutional collaboration and the lack of integration between units. How to improve this institutional collaboration. The unit responsible for assessment often tends to have a loose or poor link with other ministry sections for policy, regulation, education administrations, and sometimes there is limited high-level support. So senior management buy-in and senior management support is key. We have seen in our work that when there is this sort of support, improvements tend to go faster. There is also need to have a sort of a regular discussion between the different departments. Today, we have seen the survey. I think the survey was great. We've asked you what, in your opinion, is the best entity to manage learning assessment. There is, from our work, what came out is that there is no right answer. Your answer was sort of it's clear. It was a sort of the traditional way to deal with that, and it's probably a good way. I think what we've seen also in the presentation is that countries tend to go in between two different models. a unit within the ministry or an autonomous body. Then the degree may differ. Like we've seen that some units, they are centralized, but some other units also participate into that. So in this kind, you have differences in that, but usually we have either an autonomous body or a unit within the ministry. So there is no answer. Of course, we have noticed in our work that having an autonomous body sometimes may not provide a proper environment for better communication. But having them within the ministry, we've seen that is not a solution either. There's need to be standards in place. This is the key answer, what we arrived to. So no matter what the country chooses, what is important is that certain standards are adopted and there is a sort of overall philosophy that brings all the departments to look at learning assessment and the learning assessment data as a key element of the education system. And then this data is used to improve education policy. Just to mention something that came out, was not properly explicited today, is the need to work on alignment between learning assessment, curriculum, teacher training, or pedagogy. I saw a comment in the chat, and particularly from Pakistan, a participant was saying that even in its country, there is no collaboration between the teacher development unit and assessment unit. This is also a need that came out strongly from our countries here in the region. So I was not glad to see today, but probably is a sort of need that comes out not only in this region. So to conclude, we can say that the countries themselves are interested in having tools and capacity to improve their implementation of learning assessment and better use these resources. And all the countries in the region have implemented the learning assessment, either regional or national. And from a policy and institutional environment perspective, there is need to work on having countries deciding what questions they want to answer to with their learning assessment. There is need for have a clear ownership at all levels and need to have clear roles and capacity to use the data, report it, disseminate it, and replan the assessment cycle. And finally, this improves collaboration within units and divisions or between different educational bodies. A last thought just to the fact that COVID-19 had a tremendous impact on devastating impact on education worldwide and particularly in the region. It is no surprise, you all know. And we've noticed from a service last year that the vast majority of countries did everything they could to held high-stakes examination, but almost none of them managed to put in place large-scale assessment. So maybe this is an indication also on where we should focus going forward. And based on our experience, we should continue the debate around it, develop linkages across countries to tackle common challenges, still adopting solutions that are proper to the national needs. With this quick thought about COVID, I give the floor back to Michaela, and I'm ready to even answer to some questions if the audience has it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, David. I think very interesting comments, a lot of convergence with what has been said before, I think, but also some new points that you raised from your experience in West Africa and I think also Central Africa, is it correct? So what I found very interesting was that you said, at the end of the day, the organizational structure doesn't matter that much. But what matters perhaps more is that there is a kind of overarching philosophy and that we have commonly adopted standards and that we have good communication across the units and good linkages in the whole, I would call it the education ecosystem between learning assessment data and teacher training and curriculum development. So it's these kind of more informal linkages that seem to matter more than the formal structures, which I think is really interesting, but maybe an open area for future research. Thank you very much to all of the speakers already. I think that we are going to have a very interesting discussion section. I have seen that we had 85 comments in the chat mode. So I pass it on to Lynn, the coordinator of our learning portal, to put forward the questions to the different speakers.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Yes, we've had a very active chat discussion again, some general questions and some more technical questions. The first question I was really following on from your comments, Davide, about the presentations about this issue of articulation between the different units responsible for learning assessments. And I believe the question was actually addressed to Modu, but I think maybe Modu could answer first, but IIEP and Sarah would maybe also have some comments. The question is, are the municipalities and mayors who are responsible for setting up the learning environment, so the organisation of schooling, the welcoming of teachers and pupils, are they also involved in the assessments? So maybe it came up during your presentation, Modu, but maybe so Yeva, Tumanaya and Sarah may also like to answer. Modu is not, maybe Modu is gone.
I'm afraid we lost.
I think we've lost Modu. So, well, Yeva, would you like to start then, and I'll then pass it to Sarah.
Yes, so the participation of officers from a decentralized level, especially in districts or municipalities, is indeed very important, and very often they are involved in the implementation of the assessment, but less in the analysis of data, and very often the data is not communicated to them. And I think this is a very interesting question that we will also address in the third webinar, when we'll speak about the dynamics between national actors.
So, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think identifying which stakeholders are involved in implementing assessment is really important. I can think of a great example working with one of the big states in India, where the design was done very well centrally. But when the test booklets themselves had to be printed at the district level, in some districts, the printing was so bad that the students couldn't read the test. And so that's a classic example of needing to have all of the parts working together in unison, because if one part doesn't do their role, then the whole thing will fall apart. But equally, coming back to Yeva's point, if people are involved in implementation, they must also be involved in terms of getting the data and in doing something with it. You can't just bypass them, because otherwise they just won't understand the importance. They won't understand the importance of making sure that the test booklet is printed in a way that is legible. They won't understand why that's important. So I think it's really important to involve everyone that's involved, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Modu, you left us for a while, but now I see you're back. Did you hear the question? Hello.
Yeah, hello. Yes, I'm just coming back. I lost internet, but I'm just reconnected. What was the question?
The question was addressed to you, and it was the local actors, so are the municipalities and the mayors who are responsible for setting up the learning environment, are they also involved in the assessments, and if so, how?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, the question was, if the municipalities and the mayors who are in charge of and responsible for the learning environment, are they involved in the evaluations?
Yeah, basically, no, but in certain cases they are involved. Like in the Gambia, we have the assessment unit works closely with WAEC to coordinate all assessment activities for the Ministry of Education. Yeah, but in most cases, during these cases, yesterday and today, we are working on coordinating or moderating assessment items. And in this case, we invite stakeholders like ministry staff from the assessment unit, from curriculum, from in-service training units, likewise some teachers from different schools to come and participate in the moderation and coordination of test items. I think that has answered part of the question.
Okay, thank you. Another question related to articulation, this time not between the different units responsible for the assessments, but between the different types of assessment. And IIEP focused mainly on the national and regional international assessment. We have a question about how do you articulate between the evaluations organized by the ministry and the citizen-led assessments? I'm not sure if does the Gambia have citizen-led assessments? Or maybe I can tell to IIEP.
Yes, I think this is a very interesting question, and citizen-led assessments can provide very important complementary information in addition to the national assessments, because very often they also cover students that are not in school, which is also very important information. So I see a lot of potential while looking at the different data sets coming from citizen-led assessments as well as national large scale assessments. Unfortunately, we have not seen these synergies in the countries that we've worked with, but I think this could be indeed very, very helpful, and a regulatory framework, maybe a policy, could also set a path for this. I'm not sure if Tomanaya would like to add anything to this.
Oui, je pensais à l'exemple du Sénégal.
I was thinking of the example of Senegal, where you have the Jacantou assessment carried out by a research lab. I think this raises a problem. These citizen-based assessments are not conducted by a government organization, but by NGOs or other organizations. This sometimes raises a problem of reliability and connection between both. And I think I remember that in Senegal, we have the representative of the research lab conducting this assessment who talked about a lack of confidence, and the data they produce were sometimes criticized because they're not reliable. And there are also standards and specifications which are not the same, and which can make the connection between the assessments carried out by the ministries and those conducted by the citizens very difficult. Thank you.
Sarah, did you want to add anything to this at all?
I'm just happy to say something quickly, if that's okay. So I've actually been out on fieldwork with Pratham, who does the citizen assessment ASA in India. And yes, I understand, that there can be issues around validity and reliability, but I think that the great strength is, at the end of the day, assessment is about collecting evidence to inform improvement. And we know that national assessment doesn't reach all children because so many of them are out of school. And I think if you can think of it as something that can add information, it's not necessarily the same kind of information, but it adds another piece of the puzzle at getting a holistic picture of where students are in their learning. So I think that's the value, definite value there.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we have time for maybe one more question. Davide, you said at the end of your comments you would be happy to answer questions. So the last question I'm going to pass to you. So the question is, you rightly spoke of the need to start from the knowledge already possessed by the teachers and then to broaden the training action. So in the countries of sub-Saharan Africa, how are the methodological training needs of teachers collected, and are they monitored?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Lynn. I saw it's posed in French. Should I answer in English or in French?
Peut-être en français alors.
Oh, oui.
Maybe in French. Let's say that in the framework of our work, I would say it's a very good question, but that's also one of the main challenges for the different countries, particularly regarding in-service training. Countries are not very often able to offer professional in-service training to the teachers. And it goes without saying that sometimes they cannot even collect the information about these needs. But regarding pre-service training, normally in most of the countries, we have standards and norms regulating training and the modules, also including assessment. But here we're talking about formative assessment. Very often, and this is something that was mentioned in another work carried out by the IIPEP in Dakar, and my colleagues could talk more about that. Very often there is some sort of conflict between national evaluations and the work done by the teachers. This is something we discussed earlier on. Teachers very often are not involved in this work. They conduct the tests, and then sometimes they have the results, but this is not always the case. They get the results much later, so their role is really marginal. But when we talk about formative training, things are different. But we can say that one of the needs is to reinforce the role of training within the teachers' training and curriculum. And this is one of the major changes we've been thinking about, and many countries are thinking about it. And we've been working a lot with the Gambia, and we could say more about it later.
We do have an online discussion forum which is accompanying this webinar series. You have the link in the chat, and all the questions that we haven't managed to answer that have been asked in the chat, we'll answer them in this discussion space. And you're also welcome to ask further questions, share resources, and we look forward to continuing the discussions with you there. And I'll pass back now to Michaela. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lynn, for passing on these very interesting questions, allowing actually to clarify some very important issues. I think we had most interesting presentations and discussions today, and on the more institutional or policy part of the use of learning assessment data. So I think a very important elements. What I keep a little bit as some of the main messages is, number one, the importance, but also the complexity of capacity development needs in a variety of actors. I think this is really something that came out very strongly. Second point is the importance of policy, but that policy is not enough, that we need also technical guidelines. We need a lot of communication about policy to bring really the policy to the ground. We also need a strong high-level political support for integrative purposes, so that we can create these frameworks that allow different actors within ministries or across ministries or across stakeholders to communicate. I think that is really something very important. And one of the points that was made that about the difficulties also to read learning assessment data and to turn them into policies. I think that is really something, and we have to be also concerned that we make good use of learning assessment data. And often, as you said, Sarah, the importance of finding out about the root causes of educational problems, and the need sometimes to combine also the use of learning assessment data with other data sources or other sources of information. I think these are some of the main messages that I take from the discussion. And without further ado, I would like to thank all the speakers once again. I think we had very, very good presentations. I would also like to thank our colleagues from the R&D unit and from IS who have supported these webinars. And last but not least, also a great thanks to our interpreters for their wonderful interpretation. So we are nearly on time, and I would like to close this webinar, and we are looking forward to next week's webinar, which I think will be equally very interesting. So thank you all, and wishing you a nice day.